This is FRM Part 2, Book 3, Operational Risk and Resiliency, and the chapter on implementing robust risk appetite frameworks to strengthen financial institutions. What a mouthful that chapter title is. One of the first things I want to point out to you, and you'll see this here in just a second, is that each learning objective has the phrase risk appetite framework in it. Let's go ahead and add robust to that. I'm sure you guys know the meaning of the word robust. It means, healthy and bursting at the seams and able to withstand all sorts of attacks. And the goal here is to strengthen financial institutions. I know many of you read the chapters, and it'd be awesome if each of you were to read the chapters. I learn a tremendous amount when I go ahead and read these. Especially in the introduction. And the introduction in this chapter is pretty interesting because the goal is to learn. It seems to me the goal of the chapter is to learn from the 2008 financial crisis so that we can, what does that chapter title tell us? To strengthen financial institutions. There were three things that I thought were interesting in that introduction, especially as it relates to the crisis of 2008. One of which was that firms in general took on way more risk than they were able to bear, especially from a capital perspective. Another interesting result that's discussed in this introduction is that board members and executives or senior leadership, which we've been talking about in the previous chapters, really failed in their understanding and communication of the risks to which a financial institution is exposed. But perhaps the most interesting part of that introduction to me was a discussion on the disparity between the actual risks taken by financial institutions and the perceived risk from the board of director perspective. So that disparity has to be reduced, in fact, maybe eliminated all the way down to zero to be able to implement a robust risk appetite framework. A couple of other things that I thought were interesting in the chapter is that there were bolded phrases, and twice in the chapter there is a bolded phrase linking the risk appetite framework to the risk culture. And you'll see that in my slide deck here. But another interesting thing I thought was I read about some institutions have a zero tolerance policy of risk appetite framework, and I'm not sure that that's as helpful as having these aspirational statements. Let me show you what I mean here. In these learning objectives. So I underline risk appetite framework in each of those objectives. So we're going to describe and explain and assess and explain. And we're going to talk about business strategies, and we're going to talk about best practices, and we're going to talk about the board and leadership. But I underlined risk appetite framework in those learning objectives because clearly, when someone is crafting an exam question, it has to be about risk appetite framework. So let's go ahead and start with some definition of some key terms, and then we'll get into that first learning objective. Now, those of you who've been watching my videos know that I say this with regularity. Key risk management, identify the risk, quantify the risk, and then manage the risk. Now, part of that is an understanding that in terms of managing the risk, there are two components. There is the ability to take risk and the willingness to take risk. Now, this chapter calls it risk capacity. So risk capacity is the maximum level of risk an institution can assume, given its financial statements and which kind of business lines it is focusing on. But the second part of that is the willingness to accept risk, and that goes into what is known as the risk appetite statement. And this, of course, must include both quantitative measures, like all of those measures that we've talked about for example, value at risk. But it also must include qualitative statements because there's lots of risks out there that are very difficult to measure. I mean, we've talked about the challenges in computing and interpreting a value at risk, but that's kind of a mathematical construct and we can deal with the underlying assumptions. But what happens when we have an exposure that is qualitative in nature that is difficult to quantify? Now look at that bottom block point. Here's our good definition of risk appetite framework. I'd probably memorize this if I were studying for an exam. It's an overall approach including policies and processes, limits and controls and systems through which an institution establishes, that's the first part, then communicates, and we're going to see how critical that is as we go through the slide deck, implements, and then monitors its risk appetite. And so there's a good picture over there of how the risk appetite framework fits into all of these supporting areas. Let's look at that first learning objective, best practices. You know, the term best practices really comes out of, probably going back to the 90s when there was a tremendous move to include a majority of board members who are independent. In other words, board members who do not actually work for the financial institution. And so best practices for board composition, and then that extended to best practices for lots and lots of other areas. Of course, in 2020, we learned best practices to avoid the COVID-19 virus, the washing of the hands and the wearing of the masks and all that other good stuff. Best practices. So what does this mean for a risk appetite framework? And the first block point is pretty interesting because it suggests, in fact demands, that there are sufficient time and resources dedicated to the RAF, and it should not be viewed as just part of the regulatory environment. In talking to bankers over the years, I always get the sense that when the regulators are coming in to evaluate and audit the bank, the bank employees, they have to say, all right, we know the regulators are going to come in and they're going to look at this. Let's say it's liquidity. And so I need to make sure I have these ratios being, this number and this number and this number. And so then the financial managers inside of the institution do everything they can to make sure that it meets the regulatory requirements. And of course, that's a good thing. But that then can be misconstrued as kind of an end in and of itself. But this is not the way a risk appetite framework has to work. And we'll talk at length about this over the next few moments. But the first thing is to dedicate sufficient time and resources to this framework. And of course, it should be customized. It doesn't make sense that all banks should have the same RAF. Look at that third block point, effective communication and training on key aspects. And this has to come from the top, all right? Senior management must take charge of the process, and the firm should embrace dialogue on all matters that relate to risk. Now, this, of course, translates into culture, and I have a pretty good slide coming up about the relationship between the RAF and the risk culture. And lastly, let's have just a brief discussion on the necessity to incorporate all risks. Now, during these all of these chapters, we've talked about credit risks and market risks and operational risks and all sorts of risks. And so let me go back to the umbrella. So we've got this chief risk officer in charge of holding the umbrella. And this extremely talented man or woman needs to be able to examine the silos or the business lines and incorporate all the risks inside of the silos and then bring them out to the umbrella. All right, so what do I say in the very bottom? All risks must be quantified and a clear link between risk and return established. Intimately bound with corporate culture. So this should make perfect sense. So the board of directors should own this framework. And the ownership, it's a pretty interesting term. As a parent, and I'm guessing that you guys probably do this as well, I try to convince my children to take ownership of their successes and take ownership of their failures. And, one is probably better than the other, but the ownership component means that they own it, that it becomes part of their DNA so that they can learn from their successes and learn from their failures. And so board ownership of this risk appetite framework means necessarily then that not only is the board going to establish a culture that trickles down to everybody inside of the organization, but it's the board's responsibility to establish an incentive framework so that all employees and all financial managers inside of the organization take ownership. Look what I have written in the bold: a permanent feature in the firm's governance process. Stress testing, constant monitoring should be a part of this process. In many, many previous chapters, we've talked about the importance of stress testing, and this clearly has to be a part of the RAF as well. Here's this slide I was telling you about that I think is pretty interesting. And this goes back to establishing a link between the risk appetite framework and the risk culture. And I like the different colors here. So notice down the left hand column, it's angled there. We have some really important men and women who are kind of in charge. And then we have the risk governance policies and controls and systems, and then we have this risk culture over on the right-hand side. And as I first looked at this, I was struck by the similarities between what I went through, and I'm guessing lots of people in the world went through in early 2020 when we didn't have anything really to do, so we all watched the Michael Jordan documentary. What was that called? The Last Dance. And so I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, boy, this is exactly what the Chicago Bulls were doing. Now, of course, this wasn't risk appetite. A part of it was, but, the goal was to win NBA championships. And so, down that left-hand column, you had the owner who was interviewed in this documentary, the general manager, and then the players. And of course, Michael Jordan was chief among them. And so think in the middle, risk governance, policies and controls and systems, this was all the stuff to form the team and how the team interacted and how the team set their own goals and their systems of practicing and travel and all that kind of stuff. And then, the purple risk culture over there, this was established by those three guys, the owner, the general manager, and Michael Jordan. But clearly Michael Jordan had a tremendous impact on those values, and he was goal oriented. The goal was to win the last game of the year, which was an NBA championship. And of course they did that 10 times. Not 10 times, they did it 6 times. They may have done it 10 times if he hadn't played baseball and if they would have kept that team together. So anyway, the point of that analogy is linking everybody on the team, right? The Chicago Bulls were a team, and they had 12 basketball players, but they also had tons of support. So you link the team, the financial institution, with this risk culture, and it links to both this framework, and then it goes back to, of course, the individuals who are leading, and that's the board and the senior executives. This is one of my favorite slides because, as I've said to you guys before, part of my dissertation was investigating board of director composition. And we know from our previous discussions that the board establishes the strategic plan for any business, right? But for a financial institution, this means establishing the business strategy. And so the board has to take the initiative and set these principles and risk parameters so that each groups of team members and individuals inside of the financial institution is aware of these initiatives. All right, so the business units then create their local risk appetite statements. Think of each individual silo, whether it's retail banking or ultra high net worth wealth management or derivatives, securities trading, whatever that silo is or that business line, and there has to be a local risk appetite. And then remember in a previous slide, we talked about the importance of communication. So this is the beginning of it here. So local risk appetite statements are created and must be fully consistent. So think about each of those business lines that have local risk appetites, and then they craft a statement which then flows upward to the umbrella, which allows the chief risk officer to consume each one of those appetite statements and then aggregate them and assess them into an overall business strategy, of course, with the direction of the board and other risk committees. Now, the next learning objective asks us to explain some key challenges. All right, so I think this one's a fairly important one. A challenge, establishing a clear connection between the RAFs and the risk culture. And so look at that first block point. It may be difficult. I mean, I could have put the term in there. It might even be impossible if it lacks a strong risk culture. Could the Chicago Bulls have won those 6 NBA championships without not just Michael Jordan, the athlete, but Michael Jordan establishing a winning culture between and among his teammates and all of the support staff and the leadership? A weak culture implies the staff barely understands what is required of them. All right, so how do we solve this particular challenge? So there has to be a link that is not soluble between risk appetite and culture. And so when I think of this, I can't help but go back to one of my favorite movies, and I'm hoping it's one of your favorite movies as well. You know, Trading Places was made in the mid 1980s. Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy. I mean, it's a super funny movie. But if you think about the beginning of that movie, the Duke and Duke Securities, they clearly had a culture. You know, Dan Aykroyd as Lewis Winthorpe walks through the building and he says hello to everybody. And so you can just guess the culture had, lots of wealth, of course, and maybe some elitism and maybe some upper class and some other things that may not be as attractive. And it was fun to watch these two guys, turn that culture on its head. And the reason that Duke and Duke Securities failed was because the Mortimer and Randolph Duke, they kind of got caught up in the moment and they did some trades that they probably shouldn't have traded. I mean, they did some things that were illegal and probably unethical and clearly immoral as well. But, you get the sense of watching that movie that the culture was established and that it crumbled because Mortimer and Randolph Duke did not establish that culture that went down all the way through everyone in the organization, and they were completely ignorant of the risk that these two employees, one was a current and one was a former employee, would get together and take down the firm. So we got to worry about all of these risks, and it starts with the link between risk appetite and culture. I like the idea of developing internal value statements. When I teach at the college level, I learn from my colleagues and I get lots and lots of great information and teaching strategies from them, but it also comes from our dean and, some other individuals. And there's a clear communication between, best practices in teaching and then outcomes. And so this relates exactly to financial institutions, clear communication of the risk appetite parameters and preferences. Now, let me swing back to something that I said just a few moments ago. Risk appetite should be clearly tied to an incentive structure. And so compensation and benefits and maybe other forms of deferred compensation should have a structure in it so that those individuals and teams of individuals that are aware and are working through the process and are implementing this risk appetite framework ought to be compensated for it. How about embedding it into operational decision-making process? I mean, this is a big challenge here. So we're aware. So we have this statement, but what does that mean when clients walk through the door and they want a mortgage loan, or we have a client who walks through the door and they've just hit the lottery and they want to invest money? So whether the client needs money or whether the client has money, there should be a risk appetite framework and guidance on these risks so that the financial managers inside the financial institution can serve those clients' needs at the most efficient level. In order to do that, those risk appetite principles have to be clearly communicated, and there has to be training and mechanics available so that these individuals can make those decisions efficiently. Look at the last block point. Junior and middle level managers may not be well versed in the risk appetite framework, even if top level management is. So of course, we need training, and so we need global training, and then we need silo training as well. Boy, this is a challenge in any organization, not just as it applies to risk appetite framework. Communicating, this is what colleges try to do. I know that we try to do this, and I try to do this inside of my classroom. I teach students how to be able to write something, create a document that effectively communicates, and then be able to stand in front of a group of peers or superiors and be able to communicate verbally. And so communication is a struggle no matter what kind of a goal or a system that we're implementing, and risk appetite frameworks are no different. Now, the challenge is to view this risk appetite framework similarly as those regulatory requirements are viewed, as a system of limits or maybe a system of ratios that need to be met. But this is going to be a challenge. What we need to do is to transfer these limits. Of course, they're going to be limits, but we need to transfer them into behaviors so that we have these limits and so we have these ratios, but the behavior surrounding the implementation and the construction of those limits and those ratios has to be part of the culture. And so if you look at that first circle point, these they stretch beyond hard limits into behavioral expectations. So it's just part of a process. So if you have a limit or a range, and that's kind of the end of the story, but in order to be successfully implementing this RAF, it has to be part of behavioral expectations. And so look at the last block point: educated and trained, et cetera, et cetera. Now, how about the challenge between this RAF and the strategic and business planning process? And so once again, this is a cultural issue. Michael Jordan made everyone aware how important it was to win an NBA championship. And so even if the board and even if the senior managers are aware of this and are using some RAF, it's not totally successful unless there are guidelines that go down to the lowest level of managers. Now, we've talked a lot about stress testing, and let me just remind you, when I think of stress testing, at least as it applies to my life as a college professor, I think of a big old Excel spreadsheet, and you've got all of these input variables, and then you have your output, whether it's a net present value or whether it is the standard deviation of a well-diversified portfolio, and you go and change each one of these variables and then recompute. And so stress testing is, all right, let's suppose that we have this worst case scenario, and what is that output? So look at that block point. No real total consensus about how stress testing is done, but it should, of course, be customized for, probably each silo or each business line and then incorporated into the umbrella. But the stress test ought to be the center of the risk appetite and the risk setting process. Look at my solution down there. Boards, senior managers, and business units to determine those scenarios that are considered plausible and how to interpret those test results. That should make perfect sense based on our conversations that we've had in previous slide decks. Now, continuing on with this idea of stress testing, let's think about this from a bit, I do this regularly, from a big picture perspective. We talked about total risks in one of those first slides. So we have the chief risk officer who is aggregating all these risks, but they must be done in advance. And that's clearly important, that we don't want to be looking backwards and saying, oh, we should have done this. Oh, we were not aware of that. We need to aggregate these risks, identify, quantify, and then part of the management is to say, all right, if we wake up today and the worst case scenario occurs, we know what to do because we have stress tested that specific environment. Second block point, senior management and board carefully analyze and understand the likely distribution of potential outcomes. And what are those levels of exposures or losses that can be tolerated under each scenario? And so let's go back to my big old Excel spreadsheet. Those input variables could be some macroeconomic scenarios, spike in interest rates, right? Spikes in inflation, maybe a spike or a drop in oil prices. So we have these macroeconomic variables, and we're going to change each one of those. But then we also have silo-specific variables that can be changed as well. Now we've got each of these business units. We want to know how each of those individual business units fit within the organization's overall risk appetite. So this risk appetite is established by the board in conjunction with the senior leadership. All right, so what are some challenges here, and how can we aggregate these firm-wide risk exposures? So of course we're tempted to get out our calculator and find these measures known as capital measures here, like value at risk, or maybe some other measures. Maybe they're as simple as standard deviation or beta. But whatever that left-hand tail involves, those things may not capture all of the quantifiable risks, right? But they might not capture the qualitative risks as well. Remember, value at risk assumes normal distributions. And so what happens if we don't have a normal distribution in that left-hand tail? And then what happens if we have some other kind of a qualitative risk? Let me go back to my Duke and Duke Trading Places example. How is it possible for Mortimer and Randolph Duke to quantify the risk of having employees go off on their own? And of course, Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd, their design was to get rich themselves and to take down Duke and Duke securities. And so one of the other challenges is that we're trying to link specific macroeconomic stress scenarios like COVID-19. How do you relate that to some kind of a capital ratio? Boy, that's really challenging. However, these really smart men and women, of which you guys are a part, have to come up with some type of a link to make certain that this risk appetite framework is going to be implemented properly and effectively and efficiently. And of course, that last block point down there, I'm sorry, that's a circle point. With financial institutions, we're always worried about liquidity and the liquid part of risk. Now, the chapter ends with 4 case studies, and I think these are really cool reading, by the way. And the commonality between these and among these 4 studies is the 2008 financial crisis. Some of these financial institutions were beginning to implement a risk appetite framework strategy before 2008. Some did it kind of half-baked until the 2008 crisis. But the lessons that I talked about in the very first slide were learned or were being learned by these four financial institutions as it led up to 2008, and then, of course, in the years that have passed. And so remember, what did I say to you in a previous slide about taking ownership and realizing and learning from the mistakes and from the failures? All right, so Royal Bank of Canada, this one I thought was fairly interesting. It was written by the RBC and goes to great lengths at the beginning to assure us, reader, that this work began well before the 2008 financial crisis. And so I was struck by wondering if the RBC was one of the first to become aware that there was a potential for a residential real estate crisis that would flow into the mortgage-backed security market and the credit default swap market. All right, so it began in 2006, where the board specified acceptable risks and those to avoid. I mean, this is perfect, right? This is exactly what we as bondholders and shareholders in a financial institution want our board and our leadership to do. Specify acceptable risks and specify those risks to avoid. So that brings the whole idea of transferring those risks. So what are the challenges there? The RBC said it was initially challenging to achieve clarity, right? So this goes back to the need for communication and the need for linking the RAF with the culture, all right? The bank struggled to define its risk appetite, and it took a lot of time to develop this RAF, all the challenges and the opportunities that we've discussed here. So breaking down the enterprise RAF into business level. So we talked about that in a previous chapter, so that the specific risk drivers were laid bare, right? What does that mean? That means that they were available and observable to anybody who was interested in it. And of course, if the RBC took a consolidated view of these risk concentrations, what that means then is that everybody inside of these silos, right, and leading upward to the umbrella, everyone then became aware of those specific risk drivers. So I like that last, block point there. Increasingly integrated into the bank's business strategies and planning processes. And so what's the end takeaway of this particular case study is that the board of directors initially took ownership of this RAF. And it took time for this ownership to seep down into all parts of the organization. But it has been successful. Now, the National Australia Bank, they're calling this one an ongoing journey. And I love this risk appetite being divided into three compartments or components, risk posture and budget and settings. So this goes to lots of stuff that we've talked about in this slide deck. The ability or the capacity and the willingness to take risk, talking about the right-hand side of the balance sheet, economic capital, regulatory capital, and then those operational limits, which is part of the structure that leads to the business strategy being available and being implemented at the daily business the daily business decisions. So here's the outcome of this National Australia Bank. Created accountability. Boy, don't we like this. Fostered leadership. Of course, if the board says, this is super important, we're going to implement this RAF, And then they say, okay, who wants to take lead on this? So you have really, really smart men and women, CEO, CRO, maybe some committees, maybe some other top executives, that they became the leaders that this financial institution needed and enjoyed over time. Look at that second to last block point down there. What this resulted in was more engagement with the regulator, right? The regulators, in a perfect and an ideal world, establish these limits, and these limits are for the bank's own good. And there tends to be some kind of an adversarial relationship, but it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, it can be a coordinated relationship so that, remember, we're kind of all on the same team. One of the things that the National Australia Bank discussed in this case was this struggle with qualitative measures and quantitative measures. How do you measure something that is measurable? And how do you measure something that is not measurable? And so they came up with this solution of having a principles-based definition so that it allowed a better interpretation of these quantitative and qualitative measures. Look at that second to last one here. The use of economic capital as a measure of risk budget remains a challenge. So remember, we've got this regulatory capital, and then maybe the economic capital goes all the way out here. Boy, there's always a debate as to the veracity of the final number. Remember that economic capital is defined as the amount of capital that's required to avoid, insolvency or bankruptcy in a stressed environment. And so that concept of economic capital is extremely important in terms of stress testing and as it links back to the RAF. How about the Scotiabank? This is an interesting case study because clearly Scotiabank was thinking about this risk management principle before 2008, but look at there in that first block point, it served as a wake-up call to rethink its approach. And so the problem was that, they had an approach that looked like this, it was this big of a box, but the box needed to be extended outward. So look, more clearly defined, comprehensive risk appetite framework based on objectives and principles and measures. And so what were the benefits there for Scotiabank? Greater transparency, greater awareness, and more effective communication. All right, this sounds like things that are common in the previous two case studies. Challenges for Scotiabank included things like you got these business lines, these silos, convincing this silo over here that the risk appetite framework that's been determined by this silo over here somehow affects their profitability, somehow affects their success, somehow affects their potential for failure, somehow affects their stress testing. Right, finding the right balance between the umbrella, the broad principles, and then the granular, the little pieces of sand that's unique to each business unit. And then the final one was the Commonwealth Bank of Australia case study, in which the bank suggests that it is always considered a risk appetite framework. But it gained real traction in 2008. Of course, this makes perfect sense. All right. So what are the key benefits? Strong sense of ownership. That's important. Ownership of risk. It's now part of the decision-making process. And look at that last one here. No longer viewed as a barrier to progress. So this goes back to the discussion of the risk culture and the attitude that, of course, everybody inside of the organization needs to be thinking about and talking about risk management strategies and how the risk appetite framework fits into their daily decision making. And I think that last learning objective asks us about some lessons learned. So this is pretty much a summary of what we've been talking about. Difficult to get traction if it doesn't come from the leadership. confusing and ineffective discussions about risk management. So there's the need for efficient and effective communication. Conversations around risk appetite are equally as important. So you think about getting around the water cooler and talking about risk appetite as they relate to this risk appetite statement. And then the bottom one, I think this is really important. Culture is a fundamental part of risk appetite. So as I look at a recap of these learning objectives, I'm going to go ahead and say they are probably equally important because each one has the term risk appetite framework in it.